The angel statue. The Johnson family was very devout. Their whole home was filled with hundreds of crosses, paintings of angels, and rosary beads. They were a very polite family that went to church every Sunday and always waved hello to their neighbors. Anyone who met them would say they were fine people. One evening, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson prepared to go out to dinner for their weekly date night. As usual, they called their beloved babysitter Nora. The children adored Nora and never gave her trouble. When Nora arrived, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson kissed their children goodnight and waved goodbye to Nora as they drove off to their favorite restaurant in the city. It was already pretty late when Nora got there, so after only an hour or so of playing with the children, they were ready for bed. Nora read them a story and tucked them into bed before going back out into the living room to watch some television until the parents got back home. Nora didn't particularly care for the living room, but it was the only room in the house with a television, so she had to make do. The reason she didn't care for the living room was that it was the most intensely decorated part of the house. It had far more crosses hanging on the wall, and even a detailed crucifix that stared down at her. Nora didn't like the feeling of the countless paintings staring down on her, so she always tried her best to block it out while she watched the TV. But this time, when Nora entered the living room, something new caught her eye: a life-sized angel statue. Something about the statue greatly creeped her out. No matter where she stood in the room, Nora felt like its eyes were following her. Every few minutes while watching a movie, she found herself looking over her shoulder at it. Finally, Nora had enough. She jumped up from the couch, clutching a throw blanket in her hand, and tossed it over the statue. This seemed to help, as Nora could resume her show in peace without feeling its cold stone eyes on the back of her head. A few minutes later, Nora got up to check on the children. They were both peacefully asleep in their beds. With a smile, she returned to the living room, but her smile faded when she entered the room and saw the throw blanket that had previously been covering the angel crumpled on the floor in front of it. Again, Nora got the chills. The blanket had only slipped off, but still, it creeped her out. The angel's cold stone eyes seemed to look right at her. She really didn't like that. Again, she picked up a blanket and tossed it over the statue before resuming her movie. A little while passed, and Nora's phone began to ring. She had left it in the other room, so she had to get up again to fetch it. It was Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, calling to check in on the children. Nora smiled as she told them how the children had been very well behaved and were currently fast asleep. This news pleased the couple. Just as Nora was about to end the phone call, she thought of one more thing she wanted to mention. "That's a very interesting angel statue you've added to the living room. It's so large and lifelike it almost feels real. Although I must admit, it creeps me out a little, so I covered it with a blanket, so it can't stare at me." Nora chuckled a bit at her confession. But Mr. and Mrs. Johnson did not join in the laughter. There was silence on the other line for a moment. When Mr. Johnson finally spoke again, his voice was soft and very serious. He nearly whispered, "Nora, you need to grab the kids and get out of the house right away. We're calling the police. We don't own an angel statue." Nora froze in terror, refusing to turn and look behind her. Just then, she felt icy, cold breath on the back of her neck. When Mr. and Mrs. Johnson got home, the front door to their house was wide open. They rushed inside and found their children still fast asleep in bed. Nothing in the house was amiss or stolen, but there was no sign of Nora. Police searched and searched, but they never found her, and there was no sign of any angel statue.